This is a very special edition of our series of online LGBT plus writing events. It's the first from our archive. I think you can see it behind me, of online of LGBT books and our book stall in Studio G25C, Edinburgh Palette and London Road in Meadowbank. And behind me are some of the 1,000 queer books that we have collected due to the generosity of donors. Most of them were published before 2000, and many of them are now out of print. Your support for our archive has made it possible for us to create this new queer space in Edinburgh, and our next step is likely to be a hybrid event here. Keep following us for the next episode. I feel as if I should say, keep watching the skies, which is a slogan from a 1950s alien invasion film. You may have heard of it, but both Josephine Giles and Eris Young have written science fiction. However, that might be misleading because they've both written so much else as well. I'm just going to mention their latest books because otherwise it would take far too long and they wouldn't be reading for quite a while. Josie's is Deep Wheel Orcadia, a story in Orcadian verse, an English translation. And Eris's newest book is Ace Voices, which is going to be published on the 21st of December. Beyond that, I'll let each of you introduce yourselves and say something about your writing and what motivated you to write. Thank you. Would you like to go first, Josie?
Sure. So hello, I'm Harry Josephine, Josie for short. I'm a writer and performer. I'm from Orkney, the Northern Isles, and I currently live in Leith in Edinburgh, although right now I'm beaming into you from Brighton. What motivated me to write? You know what, it's so far back that I can't remember. I've just always written. There's never been a time when I wasn't writing in some form. But what keeps me writing is, I suppose, it's the one thing that reliably makes me happy. I love making up stories. I love figuring out how to put words in a good order, and I like sharing words and see what they do in the world. It's a thing that makes me happy, and that's the reason I keep doing it.
What about you, Eris?
Hi. First of all, I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here, and it's such wonderful company. So thank you so much for having me. So I guess my writing, as Sigrid mentioned, is my connection okay? Can you all hear me okay? That's great.
Yes.
That's such a relief. Nonfiction is, so I write fiction and nonfiction. And my nonfiction takes the form of 2 books, They, Them, There, and Ace Voices, which is coming out next month. And my nonfiction, I think of it as sort of the form of activism that I am able to do. So, you know, I write nonfiction, they're LGBTQ books, and I want to provide like tangible benefit to my communities, taking on kind of the burden of explanation and education, so other people in my community don't have to do it, and providing resources to community members, and just hopefully offering my readers something that makes them feel seen. And incidentally, that's the writing that I do that kind of pays the bills, such as it is. Not that I get that much in royalties, but whereas speculative fiction, on the other hand, so I write sci-fi and fantasy, is the writing that I do that kind of nourishes me. And I find it a lot more fun. And whereas I find nonfiction quite labor intensive and draining, sci-fi and fantasy is also labor intensive, but it's more nourishing, and just I find it really restores me. So and I guess my motivation is just like the fact that it's something I can do and that I enjoy. And since life demands that we have to be good at the things we do in order to survive, I just have tried really hard to make it into a career. I didn't really know anyone in creative arts growing up. So, ever since I came to Edinburgh, I found out that you can actually do it here. So I've been trying really hard to make it happen. That's my long-winded answer.
Thank you. Well, now I'm going to ask each of you to read a piece, a short piece. And I wonder if you could start, Eris, and if you could tell us a little bit about it first.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to be reading from a sci-fi short story called All That Water. It was originally published in BFS Horizons magazine, which is the British Fantasy Society magazine. And it's basically an alien contact scenario. And it's all about language. So I will get, and there's a color language in it, which I suppose provides some more context. It turned white, the interlocutor. Eyes wide, light brown in its skin, leaching away, allowing only a single meaning, stark. Sangha tensed. Violence was rare on first contact, but not unheard of. The woven surface of the platform creaked as Sangha, along with the rest of the interpreters, made ready to leap aside into water rutilated with protective reed and root. But the interlocutor took a step back, and Sangha realized their mistake. The threat was not a threat, but adrenal vasoconstriction, an autonomic response, one that, by necessity, Sangha's people had long ago discarded. The yellow-green beating in their chest receded. And it was shocking, wasn't it? Since the very earliest of the histories, that bright road painting the night sky had brought them visitors of every stripe imaginable. Stranger species bearing information, news of policy changes, trade agreements, distant wars on the frontiers of unified space. They brought news that the benefactors, confined as they were to their own vast domain, could not access without the likes of Sangha. In return, these stranger species, many and various as the stars in both physiology and language, they asked for minerals, dyes, basketry, gene and medtech, clean water. So by what providence, what infinitesimal chance was it that these aliens, these stranger species, should also be bipeds, should also have hairless bodies, smooth skin in shades of umber and sienna? To Sangha, the interlocutor was like glimpsing the reflection off a still pool, a limpid green surprise, breathtaking. The interlocutor glanced behind it, behind her at a safe guess, towards the massive old ruin, 20 lengths away, already teeming with her people and their makeshift dwellings. No one had lived in that haunted, half-sunk place for 1,000 years, but no reed platform was big enough to contain the multitudes streaming each day from the massive patchwork hull. They poured down well like water from a burst levee. It seemed almost fitting, too, that these dwellers in metal should make that place their temporary home. Metal dwellers clumped, watchful at the edges of the ruin, clinging to the vine-strewn curve of its side and shy of the dim, tangled water all around. The interlocutor's hair swung in a sheet as she turned, draping her skull. It caught the sunlight like falling water and made Sangha want to touch it. The interlocutor said something pale-voiced, a vocal communicator, Sangha's purview. Protocol dictated the stranger species initiate, but Sangha took a breath and stepped forward from the gathered knot of their fellow interpreters. Ze heard someone suck their teeth in disapproval. Sangha knew the sense of trust Ze felt was an artifact of evolution, nothing more. the impulse to relax your muscles, to allow your heart rate to slow, dangerous temptation, a muddy, deceptive orange. The interlocutor was still an alien, still stranger species, however familiar her physiology. But trade must begin one way or another, and trade couldn't occur without communication. Sangha tried customary greetings in 4 vocal linguae francae common to the system. Nothing. The interlocutor pointed at her own chest and made a noise. Zir mirrored her, saying, Sangha. It took only 7 rotations and 1 neuroplasticity soak for Sangha to learn Pidin, the language of the metal dwellers. Raji called herself a xenoanthropologist, the only one on her entire vessel. Sangha wondered what it would mean to be alone in this way. Raji was taller than Sangha, and most weed dwellers, and less melanated. Though Raji's hair was black and shiny as the surface of a bog pool, some of her people apparently shared Sangha's hair texture. Sangha was startled to notice no webbing between Raji's fingers and toes. She laughed when Z pointed this out, a greeny brown sound like water splashing through the roots of a tree. I guess we don't need it. Then her eyes slid again to the water surrounding the platform, her face falling back into the grayish, tired expression it assumed at rest.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to say about your story before we go on?
Well, it's just been accepted for reprint in a new anthology, but I can't talk about it yet. Yeah.
And Josie, could you read from your work as well?
Very happily, yeah, I will. Thank you. So this is one scene, one poem from Deep Wheel Arcadia. If you don't know, it's a novel written in poems, and each poem kind of encapsulates one scene. And it's also written in the Orkney language, the Orkney dialect of Scots, the language I grew up with. And I'm going to give you both the Orkney and the English versions of this. So you'll hear the Orkney first and then the English. It's a fairly self-contained scene. We've got 2 characters here, Darling and Astrid, who have recently taken up in a relationship. And in this scene, Darling is awake in the middle of the night and thinking anxious thoughts. Darling is a sort of trans character, although really actually most of the people in this book are trans in one way or another. And this is kind of reflecting on forms of transition in an imagined future and what's different and what's the same. So it's called Darling's Body. Darling's body. And her bunk with Astrid lying asleep. Darling thinks about that body and what she's wanted all her life, and what she's gotten now. It was not our head. It should left her feathers want of corporate sons. The mate of this transition was kent lang since syne. Nae bother for most of space, like chalks and limb extenders and other brock of Biden of the verse. But she was cursed with the rank and a family of the rank and a yard, reclaimed for regolith to grow a fantasy of poor, and no her own confound and sell. But now, happen her erms are in her nesh body, she's feared, she's dreaming yet, that what she's touching will no stay when she wakens. A fossil fear is out the time is only best to only preserve for earth. Her body, here, now, should not be biding in old ones, but it is. Unless, and this is the true and muckle fear, when Astrid's touching her, When Astrid casts her arm over her more as Martian skin. What maun it mean to only ken thee body when it's wi' another? And does it ever mean anything other as grief? And then in the English, darling's body. In her bed bunk with Astrid lying asleep, darling thinks about her body and what she's wanted all her life and what she has now. It wasn't that hard once she'd left her father's want need of corporate sons. The food meat of this transition was long since known. No problem for most of space, like jacks and limb extenders and all the rubbish scrap of wait-stay living in the universe. But she was cursed with the wrong kind of family on the wrong sort of ground world soil, reclaimed from regolith to grow a fantasy of power and not her own confounding self. But now, wrap cover bundling her arms around her soft, tender, healing body, she's scared, she's dreaming still. That what she's touching can't stay when she wakes. A fossil fear as out of time as any animal monster of any preserve of earth. Her body, here, now, shouldn't be wait-stay living in old words, but it is, except, and this is the true and great big fear, when Astrid's touching her, when Astrid slings an arm across her more than Martian skin. What must it mean to only know your body when it's with another? And does it ever mean anything other than grief? That's that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any more that you would like to say?
Oh, no,
I think that says it all. Okay, thanks so much for that. Now I would like to ask you some questions. The first one is about science fiction. Both of you have written science fiction, which has often been associated with change and subversion and has inspired many queer writers. It's also inspired many queer readers. And over the weekend, I discovered a new book, Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz. And this is a quote from it about the future queer lives. The future is queerness domain. Queerness is a mode of desiring that allows us to see beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house. We must strive to think of then and there. And can you each say why you find science fiction attractive and whether it's enabled you to say things that you couldn't say in conventional storytelling? And would you like to start, Eris?
Sure, I can. I mean, absolutely, sci-fi has enabled me to say things that I couldn't say with realist fiction, or maybe just that I'm not capable of saying with realist fiction. I'm sure there are realist writers out there who could, but I find it, you know, apart from enjoying it, I find it a really useful tool. And I mean, yeah, part of why I'm drawn to science fiction is it's just a lot more fun. You know, I find it gives me freedom and space that realist fiction like doesn't give me. But I guess my more complex, longer answer is that science fiction kind of gives me space to like, I mean, it gives you space to radically re-envision what life could look like. And I mean, like you see, you know, work by writers like Annalee Newitz, and you can see like where there is space for radically envisioning like queer liberation, for example. In science fiction, you don't need to work with existing systems. you know, you can discard capitalism and heteropatriarchy, and you can offer your readers something new and a new kind of vision of what life might look like. And, you know, like in the same way that I want my nonfiction to offer my readers something that resonates with them or something that makes them feel hopeful and feel seen, I think sci-fi can do that too. And a lot of realist fiction, at least as the market, I think, understands it, doesn't really offer that. And, you know, I like writing sci-fi because I can present it as realist fiction that presents a different reality. And I guess I would also say that as a lifelong sci-fi and fantasy reader, I love the idea of my own work being in conversation with other writers that I admire. You know, like, I mean, for example, yourself, Josie. I love the idea of our work being in conversation. You know, writers like Samuel Delany and even like writers like Tove Jansson. I like the idea of my work being able to be in a similar space to theirs. You know, whatever it is that my work might possibly say to theirs, you know, what can I say? But I just think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, and I have a lot of fondness for speculative fiction in my heart.
Thank you. And what would you say in answer to that question, Josie? Did you write, have you written science fiction for a long time, or is Deep Wheel Arcadia the first time you've written science fiction?
No, I've dabbled. It's my first like full-length work in that genre, but I've dabbled for a long time. I've dabbled across all sorts of genres for a long time, and I'm very voracious, promiscuous across genres. I have lots of curiosity and little loyalty, and I think something I'd little loyalty to genres, lots of loyalty to people, just to be clear. To build on what was just said, I think that something that science fiction is a kind of wish, a kind of spell, a kind of drawing down of the future into the present. That actually, one thing I would sort of resist around this division, this rift of so-called science fiction from so-called realist fiction, and really realist fiction is just another set of genre conventions. The world isn't really as it appears in realist books. It's a set of genre conventions. In both of those, we're writing about this world here now. We're always writing about the world that we know, sometimes with slightly more flowery or imaginative metaphors, and sometimes with metaphors that are a little closer to what we perceive. But science fiction is a particularly like future-oriented set of metaphors, and it's that like reaching towards a future, and most specifically pulling of that future into the present that draws me to science fiction. It's a way of wishing change into this world through the act of imagining, and that's something I think that genre is particularly good at, and one reason I've been drawn into it.
I think that's really important, that in a way, writing about the future implies hope, even if you're writing a novel like 1984 that ends without hope. There is a hope in it, that it's a warning. And I'll think over both those answers for a long time, I think. So the next question is about language. And Deep Wheel Arcadia is written in Arcadian with an English translation, as you've all just heard. And Eris has degrees in linguistics from 2 universities. And I'd also add that there's another of Eris's stories that's about someone who wants to learn an alien language passionately. And I wonder, how has your interest in language interacted with your writing? And do you think that awareness of language changes perceptions and makes readers more likely to be aware of unfamiliar realities? So could you start this time, Josie?
Sure. I mean, language is my material, right? It's the stuff that I work with. It's what I sculpt and shape and sing and write with. Language is my stuff, you know? And I suppose like um my first I don't know, my home type of writing is poetry. And one thing that poetry is extremely reflexive about language, that when you're writing poetry, you're always writing about language itself. You're always drawing attention to the way that language functions. You're playing games with language. You're moving language around in interesting patterns. You're making the reader or listener think about how language works. And that reflexivity, I think, shapes what I do in other forms of writing as well. And also when I came into this first novel. And my own interest in language, I think, comes from growing up in this bilingual, dialectical space of being aware of different languages that were being used by different people in different contexts and different places in my daily life. That I grew up around people speaking a language very different from the language that we were told that they were speaking. And that, I think, is a driving interest for me. A lot of my work in nonfiction and in my poetry and engages with issues around minority language, the minoritization through language. And my thesis, my PhD thesis, the theoretical part of it was looking particularly at language through post-colonial and decolonial lenses, and looking on the one hand at how language normalization, language standardization, European language normalization was a key component of European empire, both in internal colonies like the Gaeltacht in these islands, and in external colonies, in settler colonies as well. That the imposition of monolingualism, the imposition of languages is a tool of colonialism. And then at the other end of it, how language plurality, language diversification, language revitalization is one of the tools of decolonization as well. And that's something that interests me very deeply and that I work and try to be part of. So that's kind of one of the ways it threads across my work. And that's some of the background that shaped this particular book, which is a bilingual book, but is a book that is drawing attention precisely to how language functions and to the interaction of English with a minoritized language that exists in relation to English. And the play between those is part of the material and the thinking, the science fictional thinking of that book.
Thank you. And what would you say, Eris?
Yeah. So yeah, I've always kind of been interested in language. I've studied linguistics. In undergrad, I did a course in like very descriptive linguistics in Los Angeles, and we had a lot of our modules were kind of based around language description and preservation. And the way that like a community can be empowered by documenting and preserving its own language. Although of course there's so many complexities to that, but so it was just really exciting for me to be able to read Deep Will Orcadia in Orkney language. Like I just, you know, when I was doing my degree, like I don't think anybody really thought that, you know, a book written in a like minority or minoritized language could win the Arthur C. Clarke Award or whatever, you know. Yeah, so it's just really exciting to be able to read a book in Orkney language. And yeah, so that's sort of, yeah, like my interest in language, I don't know where that comes from, but it's definitely, you know, comes from somewhere. It's a part of me. But I think that means that when I started writing science fiction, or when I started taking writing seriously, it was really just the tool that came to hand for me. When you study a science and then you go and write science fiction, you reach for what you know and what you've studied. And I didn't realize until I had already done it that a lot of my science fiction involves language. The excerpt from the story that I just read and the story that Sigrid mentioned that was published last year, both involve like sort of language learning and alien languages as a sort of narrative device, or a kind of metaphor for what's going on in the story. But even my like fiction that like doesn't have that, like alien languages in it still kind of involves language on some level, obviously because, it's the stuff, that we're working with. So having language be a part of the world building at some level adds such a depth and richness to what's going on the page, and it just kind of makes sense for the characters to engage with language in different ways, based on who they are as a character. Like I'm working on a short story right now that involves a lot of untranslated Chinese words and phrases. And it was really fun to sort of toss around ideas with my Mandarin speaking friend and do a bunch of research and think about my protagonist, a bilingual Chinese English speaker, writing a narrative in English, like she's telling the story, and thinking about how it makes sense for this character to drop in words in Chinese when there's not a suitable English word, and she wouldn't stop to explain them. So I like the idea of using language as a way to challenge readers, because when I read, I really like to be challenged. And I don't know, when I'm reading poetry, some of my favorite poetry is work that makes me feel really, really stupid while I'm reading it. Just makes me feel like there's something going on outside of my own awareness. So I want to really try really hard to do that for my readers, to offer them a challenge. Yeah, and language is pretty much the only thing that I know a lot about. So it offers me a way to do that. Yeah, that's quite a long-winded answer, but I think that, yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you. These are things I wanted to hear writers talking about for a long time. We've now reached after 7:30. It's time for a break. Get out there and make that cup of tea, and maybe even a biscuit. Why not? Push the boat out. Our archive works to promote connections between LGBT writing from previous generations and today's queer writing, and which queer authors from the past, if any, inspired you or infuriated you or gave you ideas, or had any kind of influence over your life. What would you say, Josie?
So the writer that I always like to talk about in this context is the author Rachel Pollett, who is a sci-fi author, fantasy author, comics author, tarot expert, written many books of tarot, along with award-winning sci-fi novels. In fact, she won the third Arthur C. Clarke Awards in 1987, 1989, one of those. She's still with us and has been continuing to publish, and her work is really, I think, quite underread in the science fiction canon and the fantasy canon as well. I think partly because she's a trans woman, and her career has not had the kind of attention on it that I think the quality of her work and the success of her work demands. If you're into comics, her run on Doom Patrol which featured the first trans-authored trans superhero, Coagula, whose non-hero name was Kate Godwin, named after actually two trans activists. So that was a really early piece of trans representation in comics. We're yet to see Kate Godwin in the Doom Patrol TV series, which I'm very annoyed about, actually. So I highly recommend her. She's an enormous inspiration to my work, both in her determination to keep writing and to keep writing across genres, and also in the way that she mixed writing and activism in her own work. She was also one of the founders of the trans wing of the Gay Liberation Front in London, too. Was very involved in trans feminism, both in these islands and in the so-called United States as well. What other queer writers? So in terms of like deeply problematic queer or trans writers that I've been reading into recently, not so much inspiration, but like part of my history that I'm curious about. I spent some of today in the British Library researching an early trans, well, it's hard to know what name to use for her, but an early trans or non-binary or genderqueer writer called Irene Clyde, who was involved with Eva Gore Booth in publishing the magazine Urania, which was an early feminist magazine, and who published an early post-gender utopia novel called Beatrice the 16th. That was in 1909. It's one of the first post-gender utopias, that you find. She also published a truly extraordinary manifesto, which I've been reading today. Neither of these books have been republished since, which is a shame, although they're both quite messy, bad books. She also wrote a manifesto called Eve's Sour Apples, which is it's a manifesto for the abolition of sex, by which Irene Clyde both means the sex distinctions, as in distinctions between so-called men and so-called women, but also the abolition of sexual intercourse. It's like this really early piece of sex-negative feminism, and it has passages in it in 1934 written by this trans woman figure that I feel like they're lifted out of Andrea Dworkin. It's really extraordinary, actually, that she writes about sex as this inevitable relation of domination, which was a strand of anti-sex feminism throughout the 20th century. It's really interesting to see that from a trans figure. And it's also she was also an elitist and believed in an enlightened aristocracy, and ended up almost being prosecuted for treason, not for any good reasons. I highly recommend looking into her. So I've been quite interested in her. And I've also been doing a bunch of, actually, do you know what, I'm gonna try and find a very brief quotation from Eve's Sour Apples, just to delight you with, because this language is extraordinary. Here's one of the original "We must abolish gender" passages. So long as the consciousness of sex remains, the hardness or the pettiness which it inevitably brings in its wake must persist also. And as long as girls and boys are dressed and treated differently, the consciousness of sex will remain. Our first and last cry must therefore be anathema to all external signs of sex, refusal and obloquy to all recognition of sex distinctions. 1934. Isn't that wonderful? And then I'll just briefly mention, and I like going into these archival trans writers because we're taught that they didn't exist, but they really do. I've been doing a lot of research recently on the Scottish Celtic Renaissance, Celtic Revival writer Fiona MacLeod, also known as and published as William Sharp, a really interesting and ambiguous figure who was central to the Celtic Revival in Scotland but also wasn't Gaelic speaking and didn't have any like Highland connection whatsoever, but liked to pretend that she did, which says a lot actually about how the Celtic revival happened in Scotland. I've been doing a lot of work on her recently. There's some stuff on my Twitter about her. There's a short story based on her life called the Grey Eagle, which you can find on BBC Radio, I think still. And I have a big interview about her coming on a podcast, which I cannot tell you about right now, but I will be shouting about when it happens.
This is what I've been waiting for. Some of it will probably be back there with those books you can see. So thank you, that's fantastic. And what would you say, Eris?
Hi, yeah. Let's see. Well, I mean, how to follow such an incredible collection. I've just been like frantically Googling here. Yeah, and I mean, I'm really excited to hear all these names from Josie, but also like quite sad that, you know, I didn't have access to them before, that somebody, you know, that one of us had to go and dig into the archives in order to find them is, yeah, quite difficult to think about. But so I guess like off the top of my head, I can think of a few. I think probably the first queer, I mean, I've read a few queer writers who have like back in the day that yeah, like that are, you know, quite, I've read like messy, you know, like but I'll talk about like the our unproblematic faves, like Ellen Kushner, for example, one of my favorite, well, I mean, yeah, one of my favorite like fantasy authors. I read her first Swords Point novel. It's a low magic fantasy setting where everyone is just bisexual. Like it's very casual. And it was written in, when did it come out? Came out in 1987. And I read it maybe 10, 15 years ago. And it blew my fucking mind because until then I had been given like George R.R. Martin. So it was huge whiplash, and it really opened up a lot of, I don't know, it made me really excited about fantasy again when I had been a little disillusioned with it. So I don't know if that pauses my screen when I go into a different window. But yeah, so I love Ellen Kushner. She is still writing and still doing her thing, and just like living her life. I think she lives in Paris and just seems to live a beautiful life. And when I read Swords Point, it was the first time that I had encountered fantasy that just had sort of a queer norm setting, I guess. When I first read it, I don't think the word queer norm was as much in use as it is now. So she was really formative for me. I've also been getting into Mary Renault, who's written some interesting stuff. But I mean, I read The Persian Boy a couple years ago, and I'm writing a book about eunuchs right now, and sort of exploring that as a sort of historical queer community. And I could talk for ages about that. Perhaps once I finish the fucking book, I will be able to talk about it at an actual event. But I was really excited to read The Persian Boy because it was kind of the first time I had seen a eunuch character, a POV character, in like written sympathetically and written with depth, and like as, you know, an unequivocally queer, like not just like oh, this person is like a man, but sad because of, you know, that being a eunuch. But no, it was like, no, this person is queer, and they are a person themselves, and they're complete as they are, and so that made me really happy. And I just stan Tove Jansson forever, like just what needs to be said. So those are three that I can think of off the top of my head. But
I have to ask, you just used the term I haven't heard before. Did you say queer norm? As in a setting in which queerness is normal.
Yeah.
But the term
It's
that's
like
come up for this is queer norm.
That is the term that we use in, I'm like a professional book reviewer,
Yeah.
and that's like the market term that has been created to describe.
It's a market term. And are the people who created this term, is it said with a nod and a wink? Like, is it deliberately oxymoronic? Or are people completely unaware of like the bizarre political contradiction that it contains within its heart?
It's generally used on its face.
What a that's hilarious. Yeah. Well, that tells us a lot about what's happened to the word queer, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
What that made me think of was Elizabeth Lynn's novels, which came out in the late 70s. And that's exactly what they were. There were many queer characters. They were presumed to be living in a society where that had always been the case, and no one ever thought much about it. That had a big effect on me, and I think many, many other people. Well, thank you for that. And what is next for both of you? If you know any more than the rest of us do. It sounds like I should have a crystal ball, or you should, but what do you think you're going to be writing next, Jessie?
Sure. Actually, before talking about what's happening next book-wise, I should say that we made a show of Deep Wheel Arcadia, a performance. So it's a staged performance of a narrative from the book. A reading of it. I should say it's just me. It's not actors, sadly. Maybe in the future. With a full original score for a string quartet. So it's me performing with a string quartet. It's highly glam. I highly recommend that everyone gets their own personal string quartet to follow them around at all times. It's really, really nice. And we are trying to tour that show at the moment. So it's a little bit pricey to tour a whole string quartet, but I'm determined to do it. So if you have a venue and you would like to book a performance of this book, I would love to give it to you. That is what's immediately next, is making that happen. And then in terms of next books, I have another poetry book that we don't know exactly when it's going to be published, so I can't talk too much about it, but it will be a poetry book that engages more directly with some trans themes than my previous books, and also goes a bit deeper into some of the visual and sound poetry work that's been part of my work in the last decade, I suppose. So that's happening. And I also am currently working on a book of interconnected short stories about trans people in the pandemic and how they look after each other, fail each other. And there's some stories from that are beginning to be published. You can find one of them in Extra Teeth, issue 5, and more of them I hope will be emerging. And in the meantime, I'm continuing my research on figures like Fiona MacLeod and Irene Clyde, and you should be seeing some more of the Fiona MacLeod stuff bearing fruit soon. This kind of archival trans history is a passion that I will keep doing.
That's totally brilliant, and thank you. And what would you say, Eris? What is next for you?
So as I mentioned, I am writing a novel. It is a queer historical fantasy set in the Byzantine Empire, and I just want to play around with a fun setting and use some fun tropes and think about what a queer community might have, a certain type of queer community might have looked like in the historical past. I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm working on it right now. I'm getting some mentoring on it, which is really cool. So eventually that'll be a book, but I don't know when. I am also trying to sell a short story collection, also about trans people, but it's just a collection of my various stories that I've had published. So it's all sci-fi and fantasy, a kind of mixed bag, but the market is very bad right now. So I'm still working on that. And I've got a new book, Ace Voices, that is coming out in December, on December 21st. So that is a nonfiction book about the asexual, aromantic, demi, gray A, and the whole nebulous cloud of people and ways of being that encompasses. It's kind of a love letter to that community, and that is out on December 21st, although there may still be some copies available at Lighthouse, who have a special dispensation to sell it a bit early if you want it. And those are all signed. I've scribbled in them, made them all non-returnable for you, so you can go and buy those. Yeah. Oh, and the short story I read an excerpt of is coming out in a new anthology at some point. So.
I have to chip in again. Eris, do you know the book Trans Historical Gender Plurality Before the Modern? If you don't, it has an essay in it about trans femininity in the Byzantine Empire. Do you know this? You do know this. Oh, you don't know this. I can't tell what your nods mean. Yeah, I'll post the link in the chat. Transhistorical, and there's an essay in that about trans femininity in a Byzantine Empire context. Really, really interesting. So it's like the collection of early modern trans studies. Also has a bunch of fascinating stuff in it, but there's a specific piece on the Byzantine that might be useful.
Thank you very much. And one last brief question. What would you like to ask each other? Josie, what would you like to ask? What would you like to ask?
Can I ask like a pokey? Can I ask like a pokey, like challenging question? Do you know what? I'm not even going to ask permission. I just am, right? So, Eris, I was really fascinated by like your initial presentation of your work and this like binary that you split your work into. Of this like, this work is like practical and explaining lives to people. And doing that burden of work, and then my science fiction is all imaginative and hopeful and speculative, and I get to do all of this imagining worlds otherwise. And I'm curious about that division and like what's going on there, and why are you not shaping the activist work that you're doing as a utopian experiment? Is there space to do that? Does the market not allow that? What's happening there? Is it possible to be writing like nonfiction about trans lives that is also utopian, imaginary, strange, bringing other worlds into being?
Yeah, I think there is. I'd like to try and do that. Perhaps I am simply not up to snuff as a writer in that way yet. I compartmentalize my work in this way because that's how it shakes out for me practically on the page. My experience of writing my nonfiction projects, which have been commissioned, are quite intense experiences, and perhaps I wouldn't find them so draining if I had the opportunity to write a more utopian and more imaginative nonfiction about a queer and trans experience. But as yet, I haven't had that chance. I haven't had the mental space to really sit down and think about that, what that would really look like. I mean, it would be an amazing project. I would love to do it. And to sit down and do some more thinking about how to synthesize the two halves of my work kind of back together. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would love to. It hasn't quite worked out that way. I mean, I like to think that, my fiction posits, imaginative, not always utopian, but, it speculates about queer and trans lives, certainly. But I mean, there are a lot of market considerations that push the two types of work quite far apart.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to be like putting like the moral burden of this on you at all. But I'm really curious about what you're pointing to there, that these are commissions that are coming to you. So is there something happening, just as you're saying, about the market wanting a particular type of book and not making space for that? Is that what's going on? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I mean, when I say commission, it's more like these are the works that I'm like that, yeah, that sort of sustain me financially. And so, yeah, I do think a lot about how the market kind of these are these nonfiction projects that I try to think a lot about the sort of larger systems that are going on outside of like what are the systems that are acting on queer and trans people as they live in society right now. And I've tried to sort of draw that into my nonfiction and not write the explainer. And I've done a lot of talking about this in interviews and podcasts about the books. So I'm trying to I hope that I'm able to push back against that, and I in the books, but definitely there is like a set thing that like my publisher are looking for, and my publisher are really great, and they did allow me to have a lot of space within what I was doing within my my remit, but they did give me a list of topics that they wanted the book to cover. And I had to stick to those to an extent. I was given a lot of freedom, but there's definitely market considerations that allow space for certain kinds of queer tellings and queer books to exist and to be given more reach. Yeah, and I'm hoping that more and more publishers are going to, I'm hoping that more and more queer and trans authors are going to be given space and be able to claim the space to talk about more sort of utopian imaginings. I hope we will get there soon.
It sounds like this is going to lead into a longer conversation. But for the moment, Eris, what would you like to ask Josie?
And you should just tear me up now, because I just threw you a hard one.
No, I'm gonna give you a really, really easy question, which is just something that I've been curious about. I just want to know what was it like to write Deep Wheel Orcadia in Orkney language, knowing that you would then translate it into English? Did that affect how you wrote in Orkney dialect, or was it not a consideration at all? And also, in sci-fi, there's often a lot of creation of new language to talk about new concepts, or giving names to concepts that exist in sci-fi, but you can call it whatever you want. Did you do any sci-fi conlanging in Orkney dialect? Like EcoGuard, we see is translated as environmental quarantine agent, for example. So I guess two questions.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I didn't know actually that I was going to do an English translation at first. So at first I was just writing it in the Orkney version, and then probably about halfway through the process, I finally decided that yes, I was going to give it an English translation as well, and that was there were market considerations in that as well. But more specifically, for me, it was a decision around language preservation and around trying to get a wider audience for this language than just the people who already speak the language. There's only about 10,000 people, right, speaking this dialect. And then, maybe there's a broader Scots reading market that would read it too, but there's some challenges there. So I wanted it to be available to a greater readership, and I also wanted there to be a historical record of how I was using these words in a more common language, so that people knew how I was using these words, and so that was in the record, because the Orkney language corpus is very small, and the translated Orkney language corpus is even smaller. So that was some of the considerations in there. And then, having made that decision, I had to make a bunch of decisions about not letting English take over the book. And that is why the English is in a smaller font and in prose and at the bottom of the page, and has a bunch of these shoved together translated words, which is a technique I borrowed from the Gaelic poet Roddy Gorman, I should say. And those are all means of minoritizing English on the page and putting speed bumps essentially in the English that make it less transparent, that make you work for the English, that make the English strange, that estrange it in Brechtian terms even, and keep pointing you back to the Orkney. So that was what happened around that. And I think also having that English there did encourage me to write a denser Orcadian than I might otherwise do, because I knew that I didn't have to worry about the transparency of the Orcadian to an English reader if they had the English to turn to understand what was happening in the Orkney. So that's what happened there. In terms of conlanging, I think there's a very small amount of conlanging, but what there is more of is taking an Orkney word and applying it to a science fictional concept. So there's a gas giant planet in the book, and that is referred to, that's actually not an Orkney word, that's all referred to throughout the book as a Jotun, as in the ice giants from Norse mythology. So the gas giant is a Jotun. There's artificial lights throughout the space station, and they're called cruises, and that's with reference to a cruisy lantern, which is a type of old oil lantern that was used in all the old Orkney houses. So you get these things where something that feels a bit of an anachronism, like an old word, is used for a contemporary or a science fictional thing, or every science fiction universe has to have
that happens in English language.
Yeah. And every sci-fi world has to have its like portable communication device, right? Whether it's a transponder or whatever. And mine in this book are called slates. And they're called slates because the house that I grew up in West Street, was a schoolhouse. It was a schoolhouse that was used in the Victorian area and actually through the first half of the 20th century as well. And I used to go digging through the old piles of school equipment in the barn that used to be the schoolhouse, that used to be where the school was, and there were these big piles of actual slates that students would write on. And that's stuck in my mind, that they would write on slates and then wipe it out. So that became like the data device in my book. And I felt very vindicated when I was in conversation with Ken MacLeod earlier this year and discovered that he'd used exactly the same idea. But I made the mistake of saying, there were these old things in this old schoolhouse. And Ken MacLeod was like, well, I wrote on a slate when I went to school.
Thank you so much, Josie. That's a lovely answer. Thanks to both of you. And
I just wanted to jump in actually, in response to, sorry. I just want to say I really like the way you phrased it, Josie, of like this idea of like using speed bumps, and I really like the idea of that really resonates with the way I mean what one of my goals in fiction, I don't know if I succeed, but it's this sort of challenging the reader. And I like the idea of putting untranslated words or untranslated concepts, for example, not over explaining what trans is in a sci-fi story, in a fantasy story, which I've actually also had to push back on in that same story, as speed bumps for readers to sort of make them stop and think. And so I really like that. Anyway, that's me.
Well, we're now into question time, and Raymond has asked a question that is somewhat similar to Eris's question. Just a second, if you'll bear with me. He says, a question to Josie. Were you afraid something may be lost in translation, and how did you ease the crossover? All transition or translation has its ways.
Yeah, I think not afraid, but actually hopeful that things would be lost in translation. That part of me creating an English text for this book that is imperfect and points to its own imperfections and points to the untranslatability of various Orkney words, is to point out to the reader that doesn't know the Orkney language, actually there's going to be some stuff here that you're not getting. And there are some jokes in the book that are really only there for other Orkney people, and there are some of them, like, and I'm not going to, you know what, I'm not even going to explain them here. Like, there's stuff that is particular to the speech community and is for that speech community. And you're supposed to know that that's there. And that, I think, is important. This is a way, again, of pushing back against the monolingual ideal that everything can be translated into this one language, because it can't, because different languages have their own ways of knowing.
Like not explaining the trans jokes.
Precisely that. And that is something that we've won, actually. That is like an ability in fiction that has been won by trans authors over a period of decades, because it used to not be possible to push back on this stuff, but now we can.
Thank you so much. And I also have a question. I would like to ask Josie about your book, The Games, which contains some graphic poetry. It was the first graphic poetry by you I ever read, and I've been following you ever since. And can you say something about how you came to write that and whether you ever intend to write anything like it again?
Sure. The next poetry book that I do will have a lot more of that material. And for me, visual poetry, concrete poetry, poetry that like uses the shape of words on the page to communicate something, is really connected to sound poetry. That playing in the two-dimensional space of the page is one of the ways that we can, is another technique for translating sound, which exists in 3 dimensions, into 2-dimensionality. It's using the full space of the page to help sound happen and to build different kinds of ideas. So that's how I got drawn into that. As the first poetry I ever did was performance poetry. I was a performance poet for quite a long time, and was in slams and all that stuff, and I was very interested in orality and orality, so speech and sound, and so I've always been working a bit in visual work, and I've gone deeper into that actually in the last couple of years. So I hope that people enjoy what comes next, because the next bit, it looks absolutely wild, and I'm going to have to be working quite hard with the publisher to be like, no, it has to look this wild. It has to be this all over the place. That's what's supposed to happen.
That's tremendous. And I've got another question from Eleanor. She says, loving this conversation, do either of you have advice or tips on world building and creating compelling fictional worlds? Do you want to answer that one, Eris, at least first?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess like my first advice would be keep what you know as a touchstone. I mean, like, accept that you're not going to be able to like plausibly fill out every single little corner of the world, but like stick to what you know and what you're interested in as like a touchstone for developing your worlds. It's a really good question. I do like shitloads of research, and it's all really aimless, and I don't think my strategy or technique is very good, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing what I do. But yeah, and I don't know, like, let your special interests guide you and allow your world to be really, don't like feel that you need to, oh, I need to, you know, my world has to have faster than light travel, and I also have to like make the reader aware of how it works. You can talk about other aspects of the world and build those up, and you don't have to talk, like, you don't have to talk about transport, you don't have to talk about ecology if you don't want to, although obviously those things are important for making your world feel real. But yeah, like, let your interests and what you know about like already guide you. Like, that's which is what I do about language. So I am very privileged to have an education in linguistics. But yeah, it's a good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I have not figured it out yet.
What would you say, Josie?
The first thing I would say is to read Ursula K. Le Guin's Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. If you haven't,
yeah.
read it before, which will help you think about how technology interacts with world building in a really profound way, and also give you some really just good philosophy for writing in general. And then read everything else by Ursula K. Le Guin if you haven't already, because she's one of the finest world builders we've ever had. And she does that because she's always thinking about how technology and ecology shape societies and how societies shape people. And that, I think, makes for compelling world building. That said, I think, I don't know, some people, you can get a long way by starting with an idea for a world and then figuring out what kind of story that might give rise to. That is a powerful way of writing. But I think a lot of people get really crushed by thinking they have to do a bunch of world building before they write a story, or get crushed because they love world building so much that they write incredibly complex histories that could rival the Silmarillion for like depth of detail. Nobody read the Silmarillion. They still don't. That they never get around to actually telling a compelling story. So if you don't like world building, like, don't worry about it too much. You can just tell a story, start spinning out what you want your characters to do, wait for world detail to come from your characters and from your story. And when you have those details, think, oh, how might the world have produced this stuff? And then you can do the world building afterwards. This is heresy, but you can like write the story, then do the world building, then rewrite the story once you know what the world actually is, and that way your world will come from the story that you want to tell rather than the other way around. So that's one way of doing it. Don't worry too much about it, otherwise it'll crush you.
Well, I'm really sorry that it has to end. It's the end of our evening, but I think it's the beginning. I think that the conversation is just starting, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here and supporting us here in the archive by visiting, following us on social media, posting about us, buying books and Kate Charlesworth's Queer Writers cards, donating funds which have allowed us to open this space and create events like this one, which we hope there will be a lot more of in the not too distant future. So I'll end with a modified version of the 1950s sci-fi flick I mentioned earlier, one of the most famous for its low budget and terrible special effects. They made it immortal. And it's a reporter's warning that the world isn't the one we thought we knew, now that aliens are among us. Every one of you listening to my voice, tell this to everybody, wherever they are. Queer people are here. We're writing, we're speaking, we're creating, everywhere. Keep looking, keep watching the skies. Thank you very much.